The room smelled like leather and lies. I sat in silence as my stepmother, flawless nails, flawless smile, talked yachts and Hamptons estates with her children like the fortune was already theirs. She barely glanced at me, the ungrateful daughter she thought had lost. But what she didn't know was this. The man she married, the man she tried to manipulate, was 10 steps ahead. And today, every deceit, every whisper behind closed doors was about to explode, one clause at a time. The waiting room smelled like old leather, polished wood, and something colder beneath the surface. You could feel the history in the place, like generations of quiet arguments had soaked into the carpet. I sat in the corner, quiet, trying to look smaller than I felt. My hands kept folding and unfolding in my lap, even though I told them to stop. Across the room, they were already celebrating. Loud whispers, too many smiles. I kept my eyes on the oil paintings above the reception desk, faces of old men with tight mouths and heavy eyes. Partners, I guessed. Men who'd seen this kind of scene play out more times than they'd ever admit. They talked about yachts, second homes, and what color marble to put in their new kitchen. Someone mentioned a house in the Hamptons. Someone else wanted a 60-foot boat. I didn't correct them, didn't remind them nothing had been decided yet. In their minds, it was already over. They'd won. The money was theirs. The estate was theirs. And I was a mistake in the corner chair, just there because I had the nerve to show up. The woman who used to be my stepmother spoke the loudest. Her voice was soft but sharp, the kind that cuts deeper when it pretends not to. She smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. Her manicured hand rested on the arm of the chair, flashing a ring I'd never seen her wear before. Something about it made my stomach turn. She didn't look at me often, but when she did, the look was poison dipped in sugar. I glanced at my phone, pretending to scroll, not really seeing anything. Just needed something to do with my eyes so I wouldn't meet hers. I knew what they thought of me, the one who wasn't around enough, the daughter who chose a nonprofit over weekly visits, the one who never cared. But they didn't know. They didn't see the nights I sat beside my father's hospital bed when she said he was too tired for company. They didn't know about the calls I made that were never passed on, the holidays I was conveniently left out of. To them, I'd already lost. I'd removed myself. I had no claim. They were confident, almost bored, talking like the reading of the will was a formality, as if it only existed to confirm what they already believed. But I wasn't there out of hope. I wasn't expecting anything. I had already grieved, not just my father, but everything he left behind. I had walked away from the idea of fairness a long time ago. What brought me back wasn't money or revenge. It was curiosity. A quiet whisper that told me there was something left, unfinished. Something my father might have wanted me to see. The receptionist called us in, and the air in the room changed. We stood, walked, filed into the conference room like a slow parade. Dark table, heavy chairs, a man in a suit already waiting with a folder open in front of him. His face was professional, but there was something in his eyes, something he was holding back. They took their seats like they owned the place. I stayed quiet, letting them lead. This was their show for now. No one knew what was coming. Not them, not even me, not fully. But something told me this wasn't going to go the way they thought. And even though I wasn't sure what I was about to hear, I sat straighter in my chair, finally looking up from my phone, because something in the way that man smiled just barely told me this story was far from over, and the truth, the real truth, was about to begin. She always knew how to hold a room. That part I'll give her. Even here, with the weight of my father's death lingering in the air, she was the center of gravity, perfect posture, hair styled just right. Voice calm but firm, like she'd already signed the checks and packed for her next luxury weekend. Her children flanked her, smug in the way only people certain of their inheritance can be. I remember how she brushed imaginary lint off her skirt, eyes flicking around the room like it bored her. She didn't just expect the money, She felt entitled to it. The woman had turned manipulation into an art form. In public, she was caring, attentive, always doting on him like a nurse in pearls. But behind closed doors, she was a strategist. Every move she made was about control, first over his routine, then over his relationships, and finally over his legacy. For years, she'd been planting the idea that I didn't care, that I'd moved on, that I was too busy saving the world to show up for my own father. She erased me with casual precision, canceled dinners, told him I was unavailable when I'd never been called, isolated him piece by piece until even some of his oldest friends stopped coming around, always under the guise of managing stress, always looking like a saint on the outside. And when I did show up, she'd plaster on a smile that didn't reach her eyes, greet me like an uninvited guest, and find subtle ways to remind me I no longer belonged. But I stayed quiet. I kept my distance, not because I didn't care, but because I started to realize what I was up against. The charm, the lies, the calculated pity she poured into every word when he was too tired to think straight. It wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. And he was slipping. Not his mind, but his energy. He didn't fight it, not at first. That's what scared me most. She always made sure she was there for the important decisions, especially the financial ones. I knew she'd already been whispering in his ear about revising the will. She said it was just paperwork, just precautions. But I saw the way her eyes lit up when they talked about the future. It wasn't grief. It was ambition dressed in mourning. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't try to change his mind. Not then. Because one thing I knew for sure, he was smarter than she gave him credit for. He'd built his life through details, and no one saw the full picture better than he did. Now, sitting in that room, watching her pretend to be calm while she positioned herself at the head of the table, I could feel it. That confidence, that smug belief that she had won, it made me nervous. But it also made me hopeful. Because if she thought this was already done, then maybe, just maybe, he had left something behind for her to trip over. I watched her smooth the folder in front of her, like she couldn't wait for the lawyer to open his mouth. She cut him off before he could even finish his sentence about condolences, said she had a meeting after this and wanted to get through the formalities. That's all it was to her, a final signature before payday. That's the thing about people like her. They forget that real love doesn't need a signature, that the strongest loyalty doesn't show up in bank statements, and that sometimes silence is the only way to protect the people who matter most. So I stayed quiet. Let her talk. Let them all talk. Because soon enough, they were going to hear something they never expected, and I was ready to listen. He cleared his throat. The lawyer, Mr. Something. I can't even remember now. It wasn't his name that mattered. It was the way he opened the folder, slow and deliberate, like he already knew the storm he was about to unleash. His fingers hovered over the first page, then settled. He looked up, offered his condolences again. She waved it off, barely polite, said something about getting on with it. Her tone had sharpened, still calm, but clipped now, like she was trying to speed up a drive-through order. Her kids exchanged a look and grinned, the way people do when they think they've won something. That moment burned into my memory. The way they all leaned forward just slightly, not with curiosity, but with expectation. Like the reading of a will was a ceremony, and they were the honored guests. I was just the leftover. Then the lawyer began. This is the last will and testament signed and dated 5 years ago. I blinked. 5 years. That didn't make sense. She had said it was updated after the wedding. Multiple times. I turned my head slowly, catching the flicker of uncertainty cross her face. It passed quickly, but I saw it. The brief flash of confusion that told me I wasn't the only one surprised. One of her kids let out a small laugh, trying to cover the tension. That's the old one, right? She didn't answer. I listened, word by word, line by line. It was all going just as she wanted. Everything left to her and her children. A small donation to charity, some vague nod to legacy. And then, silence. No mention of me. Not even a sentence. The lawyer paused, adjusted his glasses, looked up. I could feel all their eyes shift toward me, and the silence, that heavy kind that sits on your chest, started to creep in. She couldn't help herself. She leaned back, her voice syrupy and sharp. I told you he made his wishes clear. She didn't call him by name. Never did. Just referred to him like he was a document in a safe. I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words stuck. Not from sadness. From the weight of understanding. That even now, after everything, they thought this was real, final. That the signature on that page was the whole story. And then something happened. The lawyer twitched, just slightly. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, almost a smirk, almost a laugh, but he caught it before it slipped. His tone changed just a little. He asked if we were ready to proceed with the next part. She sat straighter. Said, "There's more?" He nodded. "Yes, quite a bit more." And that's when I realized we were still in Act 1, that everything I'd heard up to that point wasn't the ending, it was the setup. He reached under the folder and pulled out a second one. This one thicker, heavier. You could hear it hit the table. And the room suddenly wasn't so smug anymore. I felt my heart shift, not from hope, but recognition. That weight, that file, it had my name in it. I didn't know how or why or when, but I could feel it like a pulse in my hands. She looked nervous now, just a little. Her nails tapped the arm of the chair. That's the thing about people who build their lives on manipulation. They only know how to handle control. They don't know what to do when someone else holds the script. And in that moment, I knew my father hadn't left me out. He had just saved the best part for last. At first, I thought it was a cough, maybe even a clearing of the throat, but then I saw his shoulders move, not with stress, not with grief, with laughter. The lawyer, this calm, polished man who had spent the last half hour speaking in monotone legalese, was laughing, quiet at first, then louder like he couldn't stop himself. He actually had to take off his glasses and wipe his eyes. That's how hard he was laughing. The room froze. Everyone was staring. I could feel the air get tighter. Her voice cut through the silence, sharp and confused. She asked what was so funny. Not in a joking way. It was the voice of someone who felt something slipping but couldn't figure out where it was going. He apologized. Said it wasn't professional. Said sometimes the truth has a way of catching you off guard. Then he turned to her, asked if she understood what a revocable living trust was. She stiffened. Said yes, of course. It's a financial tool, something people use to manage assets. She said it with the kind of authority someone uses when they're used to getting their way. Good, he said, smiling now, because your husband set one up 28 years ago. Silence. He continued, explained how the trust had one beneficiary, a single name, mine. I didn't move. Not a blink. He said my father had created it when I was 10, that he'd been quietly growing it over the years, making sure it stayed untouched, safe. She tried to jump in to argue, said it must have been revoked. They updated the will. They did everything by the book. That's when the lawyer pulled out the thick folder, the one I'd seen earlier. Actually, he said, the last amendment was signed just 13 months ago. I remember the sound of her bracelet hitting the table as her hand fell. Her skin had gone pale beneath the makeup. The room was too quiet, like even the walls were listening. He explained how trusts work, how they're separate from wills, how they transfer automatically upon death or a triggering event. In this case, my 38th birthday, or the day he died. Whichever came first, it had already transferred, over a year ago. They hadn't been spending their inheritance. They'd been living in mine. The houses, the cars, the accounts, everything they thought they owned had been quietly signed over to me, legally and fully, months before this meeting ever happened. I felt my breath slow down, like my lungs were finally catching up with the truth. He hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't let her erase me. He just hadn't wanted me to fight a war while he was still in it. He let them think they'd won, so they would relax, show their true selves, expose the rot without realizing they were being watched. That was the moment everything shifted. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider in the room. I felt like the only person who knew exactly where this story was going. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it was slipping. You could hear it in the way her words came out too fast, like she was racing to find solid ground. She asked if he was sure, if it was even legal. Said something about contesting, about how she was the wife, how everything should have passed to her and her children. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just opened another folder. This one had official seals, notarized signatures, bank records, growth statements, proof. All of it timed, dated, traced. He said the trust had been activated the previous year, on my birthday, that all assets, real estate, investments, vehicles, even artwork, had been transferred to a separate legal entity with me as the sole beneficiary, that it had been structured that way from the beginning, that nothing in the will could override it. She was still trying to interrupt when he said the number, $57 million. She stopped talking then. Everyone did. One of her kids actually dropped his phone. The other looked like she might cry, but held it in, barely. No one made eye contact. Not with me, not with each other. They didn't want to admit what was happening. They didn't want to believe they'd been living in a fantasy funded by a man who'd outplayed them at their own game. The lawyer explained the details, like a teacher walking a stubborn student through a math problem. Said the trust had purchased the beach house, the cabin, the city condo, all titled under its name. Said all financial accounts had been closed under my father's name and reopened under the trust. That credit cards were attached to that trust, cars too. And because I was the sole beneficiary, they were technically mine, not theirs, and they had been living in them, rent-free, for over a year. She tried to spin it again, called it a mistake, an error in paperwork, said my father would never do this to her, that he loved her. The lawyer paused for a second, then said he had a statement prepared, that my father had wanted certain things made very clear, that he knew this moment would come, and he wanted the facts presented calmly, with evidence. He pulled out one last paper, handed it to me. Eviction notices, 30 days, every property, every account, every privilege they had taken for granted would end in a month. No extensions, no appeals. I placed the envelopes in front of them, one by one, no dramatic speech, no smug smile, just the documents, just the truth. She stared at hers like it might bite. That's when I finally spoke. He told me to wait, I said. He told me not to rush into anything, to let it play out, that they'd show me who they were without me having to lift a finger. And they did. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even surprised. I was just tired. Tired of pretending not to see what had always been obvious. Tired of watching them treat his love like currency. This wasn't about money. This was about what he saw in the end. About how, despite everything, he chose clarity over comfort, truth over tradition. And the truth was simple. They had lost long before they ever stepped into that room. You'd think the silence would have meant it was over, that the truth was finally too loud for even her to ignore. But people like her don't give up. They recalibrate. She leaned forward again, low and cold now, muttering about fraud. Said he wasn't in his right mind, that she had cared for him when no one else did. She called it manipulation, accused me of trickery, said I'd gotten to him. That's when the lawyer opened the last, thickest folder of them all. Medical evaluations, psychological assessments, signed and sealed reports from 3 different specialists, every one of them confirming he was of sound mind and strong cognition just over a year ago, sharp even, the kind of man who knew exactly what he was doing and who he was protecting when he made his final decisions. And then came the reports. This part wasn't for shock value, it was for truth. and it landed like a series of quiet explosions across the table. He had hired a private investigator 2 years ago. Surveillance photos, bank statements, audio transcripts, timeline charts. It was all in there, every lie they told, every time she claimed to be taking care of him, while siphoning off money or inviting her own mother to live rent-free in his guest house without even asking. Her son. Multiple credit cards opened in my father's name. Gambling. Thousands burned at casinos on the weekends he claimed to be managing the estate. Her daughter? Designer jewelry charged to his accounts, sent to addresses he didn't even know about. Trips, bags, Botox. But the worst part? The medications. There were records of suspicious refill patterns, notes from a nurse who'd been quietly documenting interactions, days when the dosage seemed off, times when he'd been more confused than normal, moments where conversations didn't line up, like his mind had been fogged. And I knew what that meant, because it wasn't the first time she'd played that game. The investigator had looked into her past, too, including her first husband, and there, buried in an old report, was a familiar pattern: sudden illness, unclear cause of death, a financial windfall that followed. My father had found it all. He just hadn't said anything, because he wanted to be sure. And when he was, he moved everything, silently, completely, and waited. Now she sat there, face pale, lips tight, as the documents were laid out like evidence in a courtroom. The only difference was that this courtroom didn't need a jury, just the truth. And that truth was devastating. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't need to. It was already written across every page, in every date and timestamp, in every dollar traced back to their greed. The lawyer's tone never changed. He explained it all like a checklist: fraud, negligence, coercion, manipulation. And the last item? A copy of the report that had been sent to the district attorney's office, per my father's instructions, timed for delivery upon his death. She didn't argue after that, she just stared. Because there's no defense against receipts, especially when they've been building behind your back for years. When the lawyer pulled out the final envelope, he didn't say anything right away, just turned to me, placed it gently in front of me, and said it was meant to be read aloud, my father's request. The handwriting on the front stopped me. I hadn't seen it in over a year, but I would have recognized it anywhere. Clean, careful, always legible, even when his hands were tired. For a second, I couldn't open it. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I knew whatever was inside would be the last new thing I ever received from him. The last words meant only for me, meant to outlive him. I unfolded the letter slowly, and the moment I began reading, his voice came back so clearly in my mind, it felt like he was sitting beside me. He said if I was reading this, then our plan had worked. That he was sorry for the secrets, but they were necessary. That he needed time to be certain. That he had to let them believe they'd won so they wouldn't see it coming. He thanked me for trusting him, for staying quiet when I could have fought, for pretending I was defeated so that they'd drop their guard, for letting them think I didn't care, that I had given up. He told me he knew who she really was long before the doctors confirmed his diagnosis, said the marriage was a mistake, but one he turned into an opportunity to protect me, to test her. He wrote that I was the only one who never asked him for anything but his time, that in the end, he knew exactly who had loved him honestly. He reminded me that being clever isn't the same as being smart, that greed hides and smiles, and that the loudest person in the room is usually the one hiding the most. He said I was smart, careful, patient, and above all, good. And then, like it was nothing, he added a small postscript at the bottom, a note about my mother's engagement ring, said it had been hidden in the desk drawer, second on the left, that he'd kept it away when she started eyeing it like it was hers. It was always meant for me. I finished reading. No one said a word. There were no comebacks, no protests, no arguments. just the sound of everyone realizing that this wasn't just a revenge story. It was a love story between a father and a daughter, one where the final words weren't about punishment but protection. I stood slowly and reached into my bag. 3 more envelopes. They weren't a surprise, not really. I'd had them ready for weeks, just in case this day actually came. I placed them in front of each of them, just like the eviction notices before. No drama, no speech, just paperwork. Only this time it was mine, my signature, my terms. They opened them. 30 days. Every house, every property, every car, key card, and closet space. Gone. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor, said it wasn't legal, that I couldn't do this to her, that she was his wife. I didn't yell. I didn't flinch. "You're a tenant," I said, "a guest in my homes, and your lease is up." She sputtered something about the law, about being owed. One of her kids actually tried to argue, asking how I knew about the gambling debts, the spending, the city apartment he'd been hiding from everyone. I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, I didn't need to dig. My father had already done the work. He'd seen everything. All I had to do was trust him, and I did. So I just looked at them calmly and said what they never expected to hear. "You weren't nearly as clever as you thought." The lawyer cleared his throat, said there was just one final matter, something I had filed that morning, a restraining order, quiet director. No contact, no harassment, no backdoor attempts to access the trust or challenge the will. One step out of line and enforcement would be immediate. It was the kind of clean ending my father would have appreciated. As I turned to leave, she called out, "Please, I was his wife. Doesn't that count for something?" I stopped at the door. "It counts for exactly what you put into the marriage," I said. "Lies, manipulation, control. He figured out your value." I paused, looked her dead in the eye. $1. Honestly, I wouldn't have given you that much. And then I walked out. Not in a rush, not with fire behind me, just steady, like someone who had finally stopped carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. Out in the parking lot, I sat in my car now truly mine, and exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for over a year. My phone rang. It was one of his nurses, the only one she hadn't managed to fire. She asked how it went. "Exactly the way he said it would," I answered. She said he'd be proud, that in his last days I was all he talked about, not the estate, not the fight, just me. After we hung up, I drove to the cemetery. Fresh flowers covered the grave. I'd been coming every week, though everyone believed I hadn't come at all. Lies travel faster than grief, I guess. I knelt down, traced his name with my finger, laid a single rose, the coral kind he loved, from my mother's old garden. "We did it," I whispered, "just like you planned." The wind stirred in the trees, soft and slow, and for a moment I could almost hear him laughing. That same laugh I heard in the lawyer's office when the whole game flipped. He used to say clever and smart aren't the same thing. He was right. And finally, it wasn't her playing the game anymore. It was me. Sometimes the people who seem the quietest are the ones carrying the heaviest truths. This story isn't just about money or revenge, it's about patience, trust, and the quiet strength of those who choose the long road instead of the loud one. It reminds us that real power doesn't always show up with a bang. Sometimes it waits, it watches, and when it moves, it doesn't need to scream, it just ends things with grace and finality. We all want justice, especially when we've been wronged by people who wear false smiles and twist love into leverage. But this story teaches that the most meaningful justice doesn't always come from fighting fire with fire. It comes from knowing who you are, staying true to your values, and trusting that the truth has a way of surfacing. It also reminds us how important it is to protect the people who really love us, to plan ahead, to speak up while we still can. Because love isn't just a feeling, it's in the details we leave behind, in the letters, the protections, the trust, And perhaps the deepest lesson of all: being underestimated can be your greatest strength if you're wise enough to stay quiet while they write your downfall, and strong enough to be the one who ends the story with dignity. Let them think you lost, then show them who actually won. Thank you for being here, truly. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own experiences, your own family, or even your own quiet strength, then I'm glad we shared this moment together. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders of what matters, of what we carry, of how we protect the people we love, and how sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and knowing the truth is finally on your side. If you found meaning in this, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had to play the long game, even when no one was watching? Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and filled with the kind of twists that hit close to home, please consider subscribing. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it and help us grow a community where stories mean something again. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never underestimate the quiet ones.